There we go. Okay. All right, another minute or two. Oh, it's a beautiful day here. All right. Okay. All right, I guess we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Melandra. I am the marketing director here at Volpe Koenig, and welcome to another Volpe Koenig CLE webinar. We're so pleased to be able to bring these to you. This particular session is one CLE credit. Now, if your attendance is being recorded, so please stay on to the end, and we'll use that timestamp and submit it right to the Pennsylvania CLE board. So if you're in Pennsylvania, it will be submitted automatically. If you're not, please download the course materials found in the chat, and then you will get a certificate of attendance, and you can submit that along with your materials to your accrediting body. So today's webinar is on open source software, and I will turn it over to our esteemed shareholders, John O'Malley and Michael Snyder. Oh, one more thing. I'm sorry about questions. Go ahead, if you have questions, go ahead, throw it in either in the Q&A or the chat, and they will answer them probably at the end, but they may be able to do it during. But please, we welcome the questions.
Yes, definitely we welcome the questions. My name is John O'Malley. I'm a shareholder here at Volpe Koenig. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As Anna mentioned, we're going to be discussing open source software. Mike and I wanted to do this for a while, and we finally got around to it because we've been seeing a lot of open source issues, whether on the enforcement side or on mergers and acquisitions. It's pretty much becoming ubiquitous because open source software is probably in your company somewhere. You may not fully be aware of it, but there's a good chance if you're running software, you're running some kind of open source software. So I'll just a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to give an overview of what open source software is, kind of set the stage for our discussions, identify the common software licensing modules, discuss some myths and urban legends about open source software, which I think are helpful to kind of identify risks that you may even have in your own company. And then we're going to discuss how to conduct an open source audit. And then Mike's going to cover open source compliance programs, internal policies, best practices. If you're looking to contribute open source, you're going to integrate open source into your own company, and then due diligence, especially having to do with mergers and acquisitions where open source issues are always a major concern, especially if the company is a software-based company or uses a lot of software. So why do companies use open source? There's a lot of good reasons for it. One is it's free in the sense that you're not paying any money to use it, and it's efficient because it's widely used. It's been tested by a lot of different people. It helps speed up innovation. You don't have to purchase the other software. You can take advantage of what other people are using as well. It allows you to kind of scale up quickly, especially if you're a smaller company. A lot of open source is kind of widely used or almost de facto standard across many industries. And then it gives you just a lot of flexibility within your company.
And John, I think you also mentioned it to just chime in right away, but
Sure.
You mentioned in the very beginning, you can't avoid it in a lot of cases, which
Yeah.
What we found is you people have been trying to and yet cannot avoid it.
Exactly. You think you get rid of it and then it pulls you back in again. So what do we mean by open source software? So to qualify as open source software, it has to be source code that is available to use. It's publicly accessible, and it's not merely software that is visible on a platform that you can look at. And it also, the other requirement is there has to be a license. And the license has to grant specific freedoms, including the right to use the program for any purpose, the right to study how the program works, the right to modify the program, and the right to redistribute copies, originals or modified. And these rights also, depending on the license, can have additional restrictions, which we'll talk about. So what I wanted to kind of make sure in defining what we're talking about, what is not open source. So freeware that you download, you don't pay anything, but you can use the software. That's not open source software because you're not permitted to create derivative works or change the software. And there's no license typically with freeware. So that's not open source. Source available software is also not open source. That's where maybe source code or software is provided, but it's not, doesn't have the same, typically it may provide some rights, but it doesn't provide the full rights available under open source, the right to use, distribute, modify, things like that. And then there's platforms like GitHub where various people, companies will post software on GitHub, and you can look at the code and you can use it for inspiration. But probably half the software in GitHub and other platforms like it are not open source. Generally, it's all rights reserved. So that means you can look at the code, but if you use the code, that could be a copyright violation. So that, and then there's public domain software, and that's software that's just open to the public. They can do anything with it. There's no restrictions, and there's no license, obviously, because it's in the public domain. And then you have, standard proprietary commercial software, and that's software that you download and you take a license or you follow the terms and use, things of that nature. So that obviously is not open source because although there's a license, it's much more restricted than what you would see with an open source license. So there's two main buckets or two different types of open source. There's permissive licenses, and then there's copyleft licenses, and then there's network copyleft licenses, which are kind of a subcategory of copyleft licenses. So permissive licenses are kind of Apache 2.0, BSD, MIT. The characteristics of these licenses, they have minimal requirements. Usually you have to provide attribution and notice that you're using whatever the license is being used. And then you can use it in both open and proprietary applications. And there's no obligation at all to disclose source code of your own software that you've developed based on that software. But it can also have additional terms, additional restrictions beyond what is kind of the requirements for open source. So there's literally hundreds of different open source licenses out there. So each one has its own little quirks or restrictions. So you have to be aware of that. And you have to read the license materials so you understand what you're agreeing to. For example, Apache 2.0 has express patent licenses where the contributors grant users a license to any patents needed to practice the software. So obviously that can be someone who's not expecting or doesn't realize that could be opening themselves up to basically unintentionally licensing their software. So copyleft licenses, those are kind of the GPL or GNU licenses, and they're in some ways probably the scariest license for some companies because if you modify or combine a GPL type license and use the code with your own code in a way that creates a derivative work, and many times you have to make that source code of that derivative work available under the same license. And it's triggered usually upon distribution of the software. So, like I said, there's the GPL or GNU. That is a very strong copyleft provision. And then you have uh, the LGPL, weaker copyright, allows linking to proprietary applications. Um, so those are those type there. And then I just put this on here. You should be aware that there are network copyleft licenses out there. So you could be using software used over a network. And if you have a AGPL based software through a platform, you may have to provide the source code in those situations. So I wanted to get into some common myths about open source, myths and realities, urban legends, because these myths and legends, urban legends, are some of the biggest causes or risk factors having to do with open source. Because a lot of, not that I love IT people, but a lot of IT people believe these common myths or urban legends because they talk to each other and someone told them at one time that was how it worked, or that's when they were younger, that's how open source worked, and they believe these things. Some of them, not all of them, and obviously I'm generalizing, but you'd be surprised when how these myths kind of spread through companies. The first one is that open source is free to use. There are no rules. Yeah, while it's true it's free to use, but it's not free of obligations because the licenses do impose real requirements on the user. Um, the other myth is we don't use open source, and as I mentioned at the top of the program, that's unrealistic. You are probably using open source either minimally or significantly in your company, and you may not use it. The other myth is that all open source licenses are essentially the same, and the reality is, as I mentioned, there are over 200 open source licenses with different obligations and different risks that you have to be aware of. The other one is kind of the fear factor with copyleft uh, open source software is that it affects everything. So if you use open source in a project or then you basically anything that is kind of associated in any way with that software is open source, and that's not accurate. It depends on the distribution, how you link, and a derivative work analysis. But it's something you should be aware of because the copyleft should be analyzed. If you're using copyleft, you should understand what your obligations there are. Sorry, just trying to get this to move. Okay. So the other myths about open source are that it's less secure than other types of software. And that's the reality is that the security depends on, how the software is maintained, what patches are available, not necessarily on the license itself. So again, you have to look at what the open source is. Is it updated with security features? Are there available patches? That really decides the security level. The other myth, this is a big one that a lot of developers believe. If it's on GitHub, then it's free. I can use it however I want. But as I mentioned earlier, doesn't provide a license, and so without a license, the code is all rights reserved. So if you take that code and copy it or whatever and use it in software, that could be copyright infringement. The other one is we're just software as a service, so open source doesn't apply to us. And again, software as a service or cloud-based services is not exempt from open source or copyleft. And then the other one, final one, there's lots of other myths, but the last one I'm addressing is if we only use open source internally, then we don't have to worry about the license terms, and that's not accurate, because some of the open source terms can be unclear. Um, the uh, the terms can shift. The open source license can change, and we'll give an example of that a little bit later. But it's so purely internally business use is not necessarily a kind of a way to escape the obligations of open source. So now we're going to just get into why it's important to conduct open source audits. Um, Number one reason is it's increased your customers, your buyers, your regulators. If you're in a regulated industry like banking, finance, there's regulations regarding open source software, how it's used, where it's used, things of that nature. There's also just the legal and licensing risks you can run into. You can have misunderstandings of your obligations. Like as I mentioned, there could be commercial licensing surprises that you run into that you think it's open source, but it's changed and now it's a paid license. There, as I mentioned, there's oftentimes requirements for attribution or providing notice regarding the use of open source. And if those are missing, that could be a violation. An audit can also help you identify open source software that you're using that you weren't aware of. Um, the audit can also identify the kind of the GitHub issues I was mentioning, where the code is copied, the developer thinks it's free or open source, so they don't think there's any issues. And also now that code is being generated by AI, um, the audit can help identify AI generated code or AI generated code that pulled code from an open source license, for example. And then the audit can also help you identify any security vulnerabilities, supply chain risks that you run into. And then we'll keep coming back to this M&A, mergers and acquisitions. Um, an audit can help you avoid surprises if there is some kind of acquisition. It also kind of reveals internal flaws in your policies and procedures, and then kind of provides a baseline for future compliance and creating what's called an SBOM, but it's basically essentially a software bill of materials where your software program, you identify all the components, all the open source elements in it, which is kind of becoming standard more and more. So as I mentioned, just provide kind of an example. With Java, there's Java. Java was for a long time considered to be free. No need to track distributions because it's all free. And developers widely installed Open JDK, and didn't worry about conducting inventories or which Java runtime they were using because it was all free. After basically, that was before 2019. In 2019, Oracle shifted to paid commercial licensing for the Oracle JDK version. So a lot of companies, either intentionally or unintentionally, may have downloaded patches to upgrade to Oracle JDK, or downloaded it for whatever reason. And then since 2019, Oracle has had an aggressive um, licensing enforcement campaign where they've uh, sent letters, notices to companies, stating that there's retroactive subscriptions if they're using Oracle JDK. And the way the Oracle's licensing model works is that they the license is based on how many employees you have, not how many employees are using the software, so it can run up to significant license costs. And obviously, many companies unintentionally fell out of compliance with Oracle's change. And so that kind of opens the door for disputes or contact from Oracle. And so if you could ever avoid an Oracle audit, it's a good idea to talk to your counsel before you agree to any kind of audit from Oracle. So there's three basic pillars of an open source audit.
And John, I would just say, I'm sorry to put a point on that. It's, it would be distinguishing between an outside audit and an inside
Yes, sorry, yeah,
audit. And
good
of
point.
course, if there's if there's an internal audit, you do want to have legal involved at some level as well, but certainly talk to legal first before an outside audit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. So there's three kind of components of an open source audit. There's a kind of code scanning using automated tools. There's manual review, and then there's just an overview of the review of the documents and processes that the company has. So I'm just going to briefly go through those on a high level. So code scanning is basically what it is. It says it scans the entire code base and this can be huge databases or it could be relatively small databases. And it looks for, it has a repository of OS open source components, and it looks for those and conducts an automated analysis essentially, which is great because it's fast, it's comprehensive. It's a good way to cover large databases. There are weaknesses though, because heavily modified open source software may not be caught in these scans, and it doesn't detect smaller snippets, or it can maybe mislabel in-house developed software as open source, so essentially false positives. And then you have manual review, and that's kind of what it says it is. It's individuals inspecting logs for issues, examining directories for embedded OSS or libraries, and then also basically talking to your developers to kind of really understand what they do, what they say they do, and what they actually do in practice, because sometimes that can be quite different. And so the strengths of manual review, it's a great way to identify code. It reveals actual behavior, and helps validate the automated scan results, gives you a higher sense of confidence. So there's definitely strengths to it. The downside is it's more expensive. You're paying, individuals usually an hourly rate to do this type of thing, and if there's a large code base, that could be expensive and difficult, and a lot depends on the information provided by the developers or engineers, and sometimes they can intentionally or unintentionally omit information, or there can be turnover in a company where the most recent information they have is maybe 2 years old and the software is 5 years old, so there's not a lot of there. The final way is documentation and a process review, and that's just basically, again, looking through the documents, attribution, policies, looking at how patches are updated, things like that, training, what the training process is, and looking at third-party risks and agreements to see if there's unaddressed issues there. And the strengths of that, or just it kind of identifies easily correctable or more easily correctable issues and gives you a sense of how the organization, whether they have even addressed open source or how sophisticated their process is, which can give you a little bit more comfort when you're doing the other types of review. So the typical red flags that come up are, as you would expect, kind of legal and license compliance. Are you following the open source licenses? There's security issues. Are you using software that is not up to date? Is it not being maintained? Supply chain red flags, that could be if you're using third-party software that's open source, could be infecting your software. And then there's the policies and procedures. Do you have the right policies and procedures in place? And then there's, if you're involved with SAS or cloud-based, there could be red flags come up from that. So typically for what you want to get out of an audit is you want to get kind of the comprehensive inventory of your software, and that's the SBOM, as I was talking about earlier, just listing all the OSS and third-party components. So you have a comprehensive list of those. You want to see if there's a compliance. Are you in compliance with all of your obligations? Again, security, vulnerability analysis. Typically, there's also a risk matrix, low, medium, high, that's part of the report. And then as you would expect, there would be recommendations on how to correct issues, and then perhaps training recommendations as well. So the audit really impacts, number one is if you're involved in some kind of acquisition or merger. If the audit identifies issues, it can really delay the agreement or the closing, because there has to be some kind of remediation. There may be demands for some kind of escrow because of the risk. And then potentially, if the open source issues are severe enough, they could kill a deal. It also can impact help, or really with respect to procurement or sales requirements, where you come out of the OSS or the audit with kind of full and complete SBOMs for your software. And then it can assist with your regulatory compliance, security, engineering, training, governance, and cost savings and risk reduction. So I'll turn it over to Mike Snyder, and I'm pretty much on time there, Mike, so I'll leave it to you.
John, I also have to say thank you for that. And also, it's almost as if you set me up perfectly for my section of the webinar presentation. I'm going to take and build on a lot of what John said and talk about software policies and compliance. Then I'm going to speak a little bit about some due diligence, some more about M&A, contributing to open source projects as well. So to start, keep in mind that open source software is really just a licensing model. It has some very unique technical aspects, but the license language first will control and give you a guidance and tell you what you need to do. Courts have interpreted open source software license agreements and have held them to be valid contracts. And of course, ways that you can assent to them. Let's say John mentioned, updating a security patch of open source software, let's say, and it goes from unpaid open source software to a proprietary model. Well, as you're downloading that, as we've all seen, there's click-through agreements. It used to be called shrink wrap. There's not much being shrunk or wrapped anymore, so it's mostly click-through. So something pops up on the screen, it says you agree, you can scroll, you could read the whole thing. As lawyers, we of course do every time, but not everyone does. And you may have just agreed to shift your open source software model to a proprietary model, or between two different tiers of the open source licenses that John talked about. You could go from one, as they call it, copyleft license, to an even stronger or harsher copyleft license without even appreciating that unless you were to read the fine print. Now that also impacts the license. The license language is going to give you technical guidance, and we'll try to put that all together for you as we go through this together. So, why the compliance matters. John raised a lot of business related issues. Here are some more. Of course, first and foremost, especially for in-house counsel, might be risk control. You don't know if you're going to be audited internally. You don't know if you're going to be audited externally. You don't know if this is going to be part of a due diligence in a transaction, but it could be all of those or some of those. So you want to be ready for that. Again, you can prevent uninterrupted business as you either stop using critical software and try to swap in, perhaps different software. And that could be, can take time, effort, person hours, could be a costly mistake. You want to also manage compliance. You manage internal expectations, making sure your team understands what the limitations are, how they can use open source software, and then also end users. If you are a company that uses open source software, you want to do it in a manner where it's been vetted so that your customers or end users either understand or there's clear language about it. So you kind of create a worry-free environment. And John had already mentioned M&A due diligence, and I'll just mention it again, and we'll circle back to that. So, when you're looking again at open source software compliance, you are going to address certain obligations of open source software. And John had mentioned, some licenses have attribution, many have copyright notices. Most of them say you have to include a copy of the open source software license with your license, which is not complicated or difficult to do. It's truly, in many of these cases, a cut and paste situation, but you have to check that box. And that has to do, internally, there may be certain things you need to do. Externally, there may be things you need to do. You want to cover what to do if modifications are made to the open source software. And again, we mentioned it a couple times now because it is a pain point when you're changing from one license to another or you're updating, such as with a security patch or even a new version of software. So I'm calling this open source software compliance pre-policy. This is before you sit down to frame out and draft your open source policy. It is a good idea to kind of take the internal temperature first. So before you implement your open sourced policy, you want to consider the historical use of open source software and dispel some of the myths that John raised, because someone could have been in at another, at an IT group for years at another business other than the company that you are at now. And there they might have had just a rule of thumb or an urban legend, or they only used a certain kind of open source software. So someone could be under one of the myths, and it's the we've always done it this way issue, which is, well, if we use open source, we just attach the license and we know we're fine. There's more to it than that. So you want to start with kind of what people understand. What is the current use of open source software? Again, you want to take an inventory. And if you take that inventory before you set forth down that path, you're going to want to be prepared for surprises. So this is where you might want to have legal involved as well. You are likely to find some open source requirements that you may need to fix or to follow more closely to the letter. Be prepared for that as you do your internal inventory. You want to, of course, talk and educate on the risks of using open source software and find out what the company's actual goal is in using open source software before you sit down with the policy. Now, on the goals and drivers of your open source software policy, how will you be using it? What will you be doing with open source software, or what is the business reason that's going to drive putting the policy in place so that you do have compliance? You may be in the business of software and offer proprietary software, and you use open source software or want to use open source software. So that's going to be a big driver as to how you put your policy together. You might want to be a leader in the field and have your own open source software that you want to release, or you have software you want to release as open source. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. Might be a prelude to proprietary software. You may want to simply be ready for some type of transaction in the future. And in that instance, you're going to want to have a robust policy that makes sure that you don't run too many risks, or if there are risks, you know how to deal with them. You may have agreements with other companies who write enterprise software for your company. And you are going to want to take out those agreements and look at those agreements and see what it says about any requirements. If they use open source software, there could be some terms and obligations and provisions that say you cannot use open source software. So those are agreements that, again, software related agreements will be part of your review in creating your open source policy and in compliance. And then there may just be some other vendor agreements, could be hardware, could be software, third party, again, software or hardware that has software on it that you're going to want to review as a part of this. Part of preparing the policy is going to be the OSS risk assessment, and you want to look at how much risk, essentially, based on your goals, how much risk you may be willing to take or not take. So this will take into consideration the OSS version, which not specifically the version, but the type or the actual component or program you're going to use, and then the OSS license that matches to that component. Those, of course, are going to have to reviewed and part of everything we talk about today. So how will it be used? It will be internal only without modification. That's at one end of the scale. Will it be internally with a modification? That could set off some requirements. Are you going to redistribute open source software either on its own or modified or with proprietary software? Are you going to redistribute open source software with a modification? If that's tied to proprietary software, it's going to be high risk. So just laying out some of the different, here I'm laying out some of the different examples of the risk. So let's say internal use only with a open source software permissive license, no modification, the risk level is going to be, relatively low. What about open source software that's going to be used with proprietary software? Let's say you have open source software with a copyleft license, but the open source software is not part of the proprietary software, and I'll say also a derivative work, and I'll talk a little bit more about that from the technical side, but it is essentially bundled with, but not a part of the proprietary software. There could be a high risk level. You're going to need to check that to make sure that the lines are drawn properly from a technical standpoint, and you review the copyleft license to make sure it doesn't trigger infecting the proprietary software and making that open source. This could be pushed down to a moderate risk, if you do your technical review up front. What about software code that will be used with proprietary software with a copyleft license and becomes part of or is a derivative work, or the proprietary software creates a derivative work? I say risk level OSS, meaning you have now turned proprietary software potentially into open source software and would need to also open it up under the terms of whatever the relevant copyleft software license is here. So the approach to and attributes of your open source policy, you do want to be detailed with collecting all the necessary information and creating the policy. Some of what John talked about is very methodical, diving into each open source component, tracking it, and making sure you match it to the relevant license. Could be a huge difference between software X version 1.0 and software X version 2.0. Could be both be open source, totally different licenses with totally different obligations. You want to confirm technically how the software works in operation, and you want to make sure, just generally checking all the boxes that have to do with what we talked about today. Then you want to have some form of tracking where when there are changes, you can track those changes. Some documentation where you are going to want to be able to document what you're using when you make changes or when you are requesting a change. And you want to have custodians, people in charge with the responsibility and the governance of open source software and the policy itself. They can be different people, but you are going to want to have people in charge that people can go to either with questions or with approvals or even an appeal to them if there is a disagreement of some kind. So parts of the compliance, an open source compliance program, you want to have, again, the written policy. And it's a really good idea to have kind of the intro of these policies be the definitions and explanations and creating a library about open source. So for example, what are the most common open source software components? what are the most common open source software licenses. And by the way, the licenses are not necessarily, the language can get complicated, but they're not long documents that are attaching, to a larger document. So, John, I think there might be 3 to 5 pages on average, the ones that we have reviewed. I mean, they're not particularly long documents, but the words they use make it
Yeah.
very filled with landmines in the few pages that they use, I would say.
Yeah. And I would say the bigger software companies then cross-reference other agreements and link to them. So it gets a little bit confused. You have to really step through it and take your time reviewing it. But it's not overly complicated. It's just a process, I would say.
It's that you kind of have to unwind with this policy, right? So you need to have a process and workflow for how your company is going to treat open source software. You want to have it is a good idea to have approved uses that make it easy for someone working with the policy to know, okay, this is okay, this isn't, how that would be documented. You, of course, want to have warnings and maybe examples of what can go wrong if people don't follow the policy. And again, you should have your list of custodians and their contact as part of your policy. Now, once you have the written policy, you also want to have training on the policy because the policy can't do very good on its own if people don't know about it. Then you, of course, want to roll it out. And there may be software tools that you want to engage if it's a big enough issue for your company. And John mentioned some, but there are also some open source management tools that will help you track these things and also to house your policy. Again, for the format, make it user friendly, easy to follow. Again, I talked about having definitions and explanations, kind of dispelling some of the myths right up front. You want to attach the appendix that I mentioned of the different open source components, so open source software components, so people learn the names, the common licenses, so people learn about those as well. And then you may, again, we talked about permissions on the last slide. You may want to have a permitted open source software or a whitelist, as some people call it, where these are pre-approved. We know you can use them. You still have to follow all the other rules, but um, these are not vetoed. And then you can have non-permitted open source software, which is on the blacklist, and it could either be by the component or it could be by the license. And you just the answer is no, you cannot use those. But of course, there could be a way to get permission, and you can have that as part of the policy as well. So this is a little bit about the workflow for how you are going to have open source software approved. Uh, you want people to know how to check whether it's been approved or not. That could just be referring to the policy. You want to check again whether the license has been approved. You can refer to the policy. How do you submit open source software for approval? It's not as if there is a set universe that we are locked in this, at this time right now of all the open source software. New and different components will come along. You want to have a process for kind of moving them through the system so people can use them in a timely and reasonable and efficient manner. So it tells you how to obtain approval. And then, of course, who is in charge of that kind of approval. Starting the process as early as possible. Again, you don't want to bump up against, let's say, there is a huge multi-million-dollar hardware installation that is keyed on software, some of which has open source software. You want to have the process begin as early as possible so that that isn't held up, because you could lose, again, a lot of company time that way. As far as documentation goes, you want to have as part of the policy. Again, John mentioned there are times you have to have attributions, which are just a reference to the open source software. There are often very specific copyright statements that you may have to copy and paste into your licensing. Again, second bullet point, often you have to include the entire open source license when you distribute the software that is also distributed with the open source software. So you should have a list of rules for how you distribute documentation. Now, on the technical side, and we could have a separate webinar, and perhaps there will be a large as well as support for another webinar on open source software where we talk just about the technical side and dive in. But the question, how is the open source software being used, is going to dictate a lot of what occurs in your policy, what happens with warnings, what happens with licensing, and you are going to be quite concerned about whether you are. So this is an example where you have proprietary software and there is an open source component that is to be used with the proprietary software. What you want to avoid in almost all instances is creating a derivative work. That means either the open source software has been modified, the proprietary software builds upon the open source software. And again, this is very simple. Again, it's very technical. There's a lot of legalese to it, but we've broken it down into kind of the simplest concepts. And is the proprietary software based on is actually a term they use in open source software. And there's a lot of debate as to what based on means. Now, one interesting and curious thing about these open source software licenses is they use the term derivative works, but it is not the same definition of derivative works that is in the Copyright Act, which would make, of course, things easier, but things can't be easy. They have to be technical and complicated. So they use the term derivative work and then they define what that means. But then there's some commentators who say it builds on the copyright definition of derivative works. Some say no, it's just the contractual language. This is why a legal team may be so important here. As part of derivative works, or whether you've created a derivative work with open source software as part of it, there will be a review of what's called static linking or dynamic linking. And again, this is at a very basic level. Static linking, I think of it as the proprietary software effectively becomes one with the open source software. And in this way, it infects the open source software. So it is effectively bundled together or runs all together. Again, it could get very technical. Now, dynamic linking is when the software, essentially the open source software, talks to the proprietary software on an as needed basis, but they don't meld together. It's likely okay, but it still requires analysis because there are levels. There could be levels of how that happens. Uh, Continuing on through the policy, specific custodians charged with governance, which are really running the policy, legal review, technical review, approval. They're really, it is always best to have people who are in charge of certain things, and then they can take ownership of it. So not that complicated, but necessary. Now, once you have audits and compliance and policies and due diligence, again, it's important to have internal education that should be updated periodically. If it was 2019 and you had your meeting about Java open source software early in the year and everyone was confident and felt that it could be used, in a manner that did not trigger some kind of payment. If you had that meeting in the beginning of the year, but not at the end of the year, everything changed by October. John, was it October 2019?
Yeah, October 2019.
Okay.
Sorry.
A date
Yeah.
burned into your memory. Okay, so if you had it, before or after, it would change what the training would be. And again, keep your library updated, as there are often new GPL licenses rolled out or open source software licenses. And again, this is about catching issues early, or at least earlier in the time frame. Some about due diligence with open source software. So it's really, you're going to do detective work and fact finding to first, and this is where mistakes can be made. It's getting the correct name, the correct version number, and the correct date of the open source software component, and matching that with the correct open source software license for that version, which here we're using the term provenance, which I'll talk about in a minute. Your detective work will follow, how it's being used, whether there's modifications, and how it's being distributed. Now, provenance is really the documented origin in history. It's a lot like in fine art when they want to follow the origin of a painting all the way from the original artist to the seller. These are important because this will impact what license controls and what language controls. So, what is the origin? Where did it come from? I mean, IT people can come and go, vendors can come and go. So, trying to nail down where this open source actually originated, who maintained it? It is often there are people with institutional knowledge who can be extraordinarily helpful, obviously, in due diligence. What licenses apply? Again, a lot that's going to trigger a lot of information. How has it changed over time? Was it ever updated? Did you just get, is it software from a vendor that came with an open source component and there's never been any updates of any kind? The versions, any known vulnerabilities, for example, are there security issues with some open source software that has come out over time? And again, the same legal and licensing red flags that John had mentioned earlier in the presentation. On the information collection, you may have and may want to update your due diligence checklist. The due diligence checklist may have an open source software section. It will have, areas that are very similar to the areas that are listed here. I think this due diligence checklist kind of collects a lot of the different information from some of the slides that we did today. I'm a big fan of collecting, the people, the names of the people, and collecting their information again because time and again, institutional knowledge has really been, the savior for a lot of due diligence. And also, it's important third-party involvement. A lot of companies do not do their in-house software, and you are going to want to identify the companies they work with and kind of what the history of the company is. Have there ever been open source software? Have you ever done an open source compliance review or an audit? And do you have a policy? And have there ever been issues? You are going to want to get copies of all the software licenses as part of any due diligence, and the vendor agreements that have to do with software. One slide, and again, it could probably be its own presentation, but most open source software licenses are silent on patents. They do not mention it. Some, and there's an example on the screen, do mention it, and they have significant patent related provisions. And if you use that open source software, you don't want to have your patent portfolio hamstrung just by using a piece of software. It can be a trap. So if it comes up, if you see the word patent or something about patents in an open source software license, make sure you immediately flag it, tell legal, and bring in someone to take a look at that. It is possible that your company want to release or contribute to an open source software project. Why would you want to do that? Well, what if you are creating a new ecosystem with your software? In that case, you may want to set the ground rules for that ecosystem, or you may want to set standards with how your software operates, and therefore you want to initially release it in an open source software model. So you will have to sit down and figure out what the licensing model is and how you're going to make it. You could use one of the existing licenses, or you can write your own fresh open source or copyleft license. It could be good for company reputation and thought leadership. It could build goodwill in the relevant business community. And you may be setting up for a proprietary model once people adopt it. So there's plenty of reasons to do this. In the beginning, what's the business purpose? You want to make sure that you're not accidentally giving away, as they say, the crown jewels. So you want to confirm what isn't open source, and you want to select the correct license and then have distribution control. And you want to make sure that you can not only control how it's distributed, but track how it's distributed. So to kind of sum everything up today for best practices with open source software, create an environment of culture where you're aware of it, have policies in place that include training and internal education, perform periodic updates, and have dedicated groups in charge of open source software. And I think we are right on time, and we can field if there are questions.
So Mike, great presentation, guys. I am not seeing questions, but I have gotten some inquiries about some tech issues with downloading the handouts. I put an email address in the chat. If you have a
Great.
problem, just email me and I'll send it to you. I just wanted to say that also the evaluation form is in there.
All right. Well, we'll stay on the line if there are any questions. We want to thank everyone for joining us. Any one of those slides I think could have rolled out into its own presentation, but we tried to put it all together to give people a little flavor of everything about open source software, and the tricks, tips, and traps. So again, we'll stay on the line for the whole time, but we thank everyone, and make sure to get your credits and get copies, and Anna will help you in any way you can.
Yes, our next webinar, I just posted in the chat, is on December 9th. The topic is fast patent prosecution, and we will send out a message. So Mike, I think I'm not seeing any questions. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Oh, we're just getting comments on the presentation. So.
Oh, we appreciate it.
Okay. All right. Well,
Those
thank
are
you,
better
everyone.
than questions.
Yes. All right. Everybody have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.